For nearly 2,000 years, humanity has searched for answers about one of the most influential figures who ever lived. His words have inspired civilizations. His image has shaped art, politics, philosophy, and culture. His name has been spoken by billions of people across every continent. But hidden inside the story of Jesus of Nazareth is a mystery that has remained unanswered for centuries. A gap, a silence, a missing chapter. The historical record tells us about his birth. It tells us about his family. It tells us about the final years of his life, the teachings that changed the world, and the movement that would eventually become one of the largest religions in human history. But between the young boy who appears briefly in ancient writings and the adult teacher who suddenly enters the historical stage, something disappears. Nearly 2 decades. Years that shaped the person who would later transform history. Years that no surviving source fully explains. Where was Jesus during this time? What was he doing? Who influenced him? What experiences formed the man whose teachings would echo through thousands of years? For believers, these years represent a hidden part of a sacred story. For historians, they represent one of the most fascinating unanswered questions of the ancient world. And for skeptics, they represent something even more intriguing. A reminder that even the most famous figures in history can remain partly unknown. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries are not found in forgotten places. They are found in the empty spaces between the facts. This is the story of the lost years of Jesus, a journey through ancient texts, historical evidence, competing theories, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround one of history's most influential figures. To understand the mystery, we must first return to the world where Jesus lived. A world very different from our own. The first century was an age of powerful empires, religious movements, and political uncertainty. The Roman Empire stretched across much of the known world. Its roads connected distant regions. Its armies enforced imperial authority. Its leaders controlled territories from Europe to North Africa and into the Middle East. But beneath the power of Rome existed a complex network of cultures and identities. Among them was the Jewish population of Judea and Galilee. For many Jewish communities, religion was not simply a private belief. It shaped every part of life. It influenced family traditions, social relationships, laws, and hopes for the future. People looked to ancient scriptures for meaning. They searched for signs of what might come next. And many lived with the expectation that history was approaching a turning point, a promised figure, a moment of restoration, a new beginning. It was into this world of tension, expectation, and uncertainty that Jesus was born. The earliest surviving accounts of Jesus come from ancient Christian writings known today as the Gospels. These texts describe important moments of his life, his birth, his teachings, his followers, his final days. But when historians examine these writings closely, they discover something unusual. The story is not a complete biography. It is not a detailed record of every year of his life. Instead, the accounts focus primarily on the period when Jesus began his public ministry. The years before that moment remain mostly hidden. One of the few glimpses comes from the Gospel of Luke. It describes a young Jesus visiting Jerusalem with his family during a religious festival. According to the account, he was around 12 years old when he was found discussing religious matters with teachers at the temple. The story presents a child already deeply engaged with questions of faith and knowledge. But after this moment, the narrative suddenly becomes silent. The next time Jesus appears, he is no longer a child. He is an adult.
He begins traveling,
Teaching, gathering followers, and within a remarkably short period of time, his message begins spreading throughout the region. But what happened in between? This silence has fascinated historians for generations. Because the missing years are not just a small detail. They represent the transition between two completely different versions of Jesus. The young person growing up in Nazareth, and the teacher whose influence would eventually reshape human history. The question seems simple: what happened during those years? But answering it is far more complicated than it appears. Because history does not work like a modern investigation. Today, we expect records everywhere. Photographs, documents, videos, personal messages, government files. But the ancient world preserved information very differently. Most people who lived 2,000 years ago disappeared from history completely. They left behind no biography, No personal writings, no detailed timeline. Their lives existed only in the memories of their families and communities, and eventually, even those memories faded away. From this perspective, the mystery of Jesus' lost years becomes part of a much larger historical reality. The past is not a complete story. It is a collection of fragments. Some pieces survive, others disappear forever. But Jesus is not remembered as an ordinary person. His life became one of the most influential stories in human history. And that creates a natural curiosity. People want to understand the person behind the movement, before the teachings, before the followers, before the global influence. Who was Jesus during those hidden years? What shaped his worldview? What experiences influenced the ideas that would later define his public message? These questions have led historians, writers, and researchers to explore many possibilities. Some theories are simple, some are controversial. Some exist somewhere between historical evidence and legend, and this is where the investigation begins. The first possibility is also the most traditional. Perhaps the missing years were not mysterious at all. Perhaps Jesus lived a normal life in Nazareth, a small village in Galilee, a place far away from the centers of Roman power, far away from the political elites, far away from the famous cities that dominated ancient history. Nazareth was not a place where many people expected a world-changing figure to emerge. It was an ordinary community. People worked, families lived together, religious traditions were practiced, daily life continued, and according to many historians, this ordinary environment may have been exactly what shaped Jesus. Because before someone becomes a historical figure, they are first a person influenced by family, culture, language, community, and the world around them. Ancient sources suggest that Jesus may have worked as a craftsman. The Greek word often associated with his occupation is tekton. For centuries, this has commonly been translated as carpenter. However, some scholars argue that the term may have had a broader meaning, referring to someone who worked with materials such as wood or stone. Whatever the exact profession, the image that emerges is not one of luxury or privilege. It is the image of someone connected to ordinary working life, someone who understood the experiences of common people, their struggles, their hopes, their daily realities. And perhaps this background helps explain why later teachings connected so strongly with ordinary communities. But while this explanation may be the most straightforward, it does not answer every question. Because the transition from a quiet life in Nazareth to a public figure who attracted followers and challenged established ideas remains historically fascinating. Something happened. Something changed. The young man from Nazareth became the teacher from Galilee. The question is not only where Jesus was. The question is, what transformed him? But if Jesus simply lived a quiet life in Nazareth, another question appears. How did a man from a small village become someone whose teachings would eventually influence billions of people? What experiences shaped his understanding of faith, morality, and human nature? This question has led researchers to explore another possibility. Perhaps the missing years were not empty. Perhaps they were years of learning, reflection, and spiritual development. And throughout history, several theories have attempted to explain what may have happened during this hidden period. Some theories are supported by historical possibilities. Others are built on later traditions. And some exist in the space between evidence and imagination. Understanding the difference between these ideas is where the real investigation begins. One of the earliest questions historians examine is whether Jesus may have been influenced by different Jewish movements that existed during his lifetime. The first century was not a period of religious uniformity. Judaism during this era contained many different groups, interpretations, and traditions. There were debates about scripture, debates about purity, debates about the future of Israel. Different communities had different ideas about how people should live and what role religion should play in society. Among these groups were the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and a lesser-known community often associated with the Essenes. The Essenes have attracted particular attention because of discoveries made thousands of years later. In 1947, a group of ancient scrolls was discovered near the Dead Sea. Known today as the Dead Sea Scrolls, these documents became one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The scrolls contained religious writings, interpretations of scripture, and information about a Jewish community that existed around the same period as Jesus. When researchers studied these texts, they discovered ideas that reflected the religious atmosphere of the time. Themes of purity, a struggle between good and evil, a coming transformation, a community preparing for a significant moment in history. Some people noticed similarities between these ideas and themes later associated with Jesus, and this raised an intriguing possibility. Could Jesus have encountered groups like the Essenes? Could these communities have influenced the environment in which his teachings developed? The answer is complicated. There are similarities, but similarities alone do not prove direct contact. The world Jesus lived in was filled with religious discussions and shared cultural ideas. Two groups could develop similar beliefs because they were responding to the same historical circumstances. A population living under foreign rule, a society searching for hope, a community asking questions about justice, suffering, and the future. Historians therefore approach this theory carefully. It is possible that Jesus was influenced by the religious environment around him. But there is no clear evidence proving that he belonged to the Essenes or studied directly with them. And this distinction matters. Because historical investigation is not about choosing the most fascinating story, it is about understanding what the evidence can actually support. But perhaps the most famous theory about the lost years of Jesus is also the most controversial. The idea that Jesus may have traveled beyond the borders of Judea. Some writers have suggested that during the years missing from historical records, Jesus may have journeyed eastward, to places such as India, Tibet, or other regions connected with ancient spiritual traditions. According to these theories, Jesus may have encountered different philosophies and teachers, gaining knowledge that later appeared in his teachings. The idea is attractive because it creates a dramatic image. A young Jesus leaving his homeland, traveling across distant lands, studying with different cultures, and returning with a deeper understanding of spirituality. It sounds like the missing chapter of an epic journey. But history asks a difficult question: where is the evidence? The main challenge with these theories is that they rely heavily on sources created much later than the time of Jesus. There are no surviving first-century records confirming that Jesus traveled to India. No Roman documents, no Jewish writings, no early Christian accounts describing such a journey. The idea became popular mainly through modern authors and later traditions. This does not mean travel was impossible. The ancient world was more connected than many people realize. Trade routes stretched across enormous distances. Merchants, travelers, soldiers, and religious thinkers moved between regions. Ideas traveled. Languages mixed. Cultures influenced each other. So a journey from one region to another was not impossible, but possibility alone cannot establish history. This is one of the most important lessons in studying the past. There is a difference between what could have happened and what do we have evidence happened. History is built on the second question. A theory can be fascinating, a possibility can inspire curiosity, but without evidence, it remains speculation. And this is where the mystery of Jesus becomes especially interesting. Because the absence of evidence creates a space where imagination begins. Throughout history, humans have always been drawn toward hidden chapters. When information disappears, stories appear. When questions remain unanswered, people search for meaning. This has happened with countless historical figures. People wonder about the secrets of ancient rulers, the private lives of famous thinkers, the unknown moments before great discoveries. But the curiosity surrounding Jesus is unique because his influence was not limited to one nation or one period. His story became connected with the identity of entire civilizations. So the missing years became more than a historical question. They became a question about the origins of a movement that transformed the world. Another fascinating aspect of the mystery is the difference between the historical Jesus and the remembered Jesus. Historians study Jesus as a person who lived in a specific time and place, a Jewish man living under Roman rule in first-century Judea. They examine archaeology, ancient cultural context. Believers, however, often approach Jesus' historical patterns. They see his life not only as a historical event, but as part of a larger spiritual reality. These two perspectives do not always ask the same questions. A historian may ask, what can the evidence tell us about Jesus' life? A believer may ask, what does Jesus' life mean? Both questions exist. And understanding the lost years requires recognizing that this mystery sits at the meeting point between history and belief. Perhaps this is why the question has survived for so long. Because people are not only searching for information, they are searching for understanding. They want to know what shaped one of history's most influential figures. They want to know what happened before the world knew his name. And they want to understand how an ordinary life in a small village became a story that would echo across centuries. But there is another layer to this mystery. The lost years of Jesus are not only about missing information, they also reveal something about how history itself works. The past is not preserved equally. The lives of powerful rulers are often recorded. The battles of empires are documented. The decisions of kings are written down. But the daily lives of ordinary people are often forgotten. The conversations, the personal struggles, the moments of growth, the experiences that quietly shape a person before the world notices them, those are the moments history often loses, and perhaps that is the most human part of this mystery. Before Jesus became a figure known across the world, he was someone living an ordinary human life. He experienced a world filled with uncertainty. He lived among people with hopes and fears. He belonged to a community with traditions stretching back generations. Whatever happened during those hidden years, they were years lived by a real person in a real historical setting. And understanding that reality may be just as important as discovering a forgotten event. But the investigation is far from over, because beyond the theories of travel and religious influence lies another question. What do the ancient texts outside the traditional biblical accounts reveal? Are there forgotten writings that tell a different story? Were there other versions of Jesus' life that disappeared? And why did some ancient texts become accepted while others were rejected? To answer these questions, we have to explore the forgotten documents of the ancient world. Because sometimes the secrets of history are not hidden in what was written. They are hidden in what was left behind. The search for the lost years of Jesus leads us to one of the most fascinating areas of ancient history, the forgotten writings. Across centuries, countless texts have been discovered, preserved, lost, and debated. Some became part of established religious tradition. Others disappeared into history. Some were considered valuable historical sources. Others were rejected, questioned, or viewed as later interpretations. And hidden among these writings is another mystery. Did ancient communities preserve different memories of Jesus? And could some of these forgotten texts contain clues about the years that remain unknown? When modern audiences imagine the Bible, they often imagine a single book that appeared exactly as it exists today. But history tells a more complex story. The collection known as the New Testament developed over time. Early Christian communities shared different writings, letters, teachings, and accounts. These communities existed across different regions of the Roman Empire. They spoke different languages, they faced different challenges, and they often had different questions about the meaning of Jesus' life. The process of deciding which writings become central to Christian tradition was gradual. It involved centuries of discussion, debate, and interpretation. Among the many ancient writings discovered over time are texts known as the Gnostic Gospels. These writings include works such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and other texts discovered in collections like the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt during the 20th century. These documents are historically fascinating because they reveal the diversity of early Christian thought. They show that early followers of Jesus did not always understand his message in exactly the same way. Different groups emphasized different ideas, different communities preserved different traditions. And these writings provide a window into a world where Christianity was still developing. However, when researchers examine these texts, another important question appears. Do these writings actually provide information about the lost years of Jesus? The answer is more complicated than many people expect. Most of these texts do not provide a detailed biography of Jesus' hidden years. They do not reveal a secret timeline of where he traveled or who he studied with. Instead, they reveal something else. They show how different communities remembered Jesus. They show how his followers continued to ask questions about his identity, his teachings, and his significance. In other words, they may not solve the mystery, but they reveal why the mystery became so important. One example is the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the traditional Gospels, it is not written as narrative story of Jesus' life. Instead, it is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. For scholars, texts like this are valuable because they demonstrate that early Christianity was not a single uniform movement. It was a collection of communities exploring different interpretations. Some focused on Jesus' actions, some focused on his teachings, some focused on his spiritual meaning. The diversity of these early traditions raises an important question. If ancient people had different understandings of Jesus, how do historians determine what information is closest to the historical figure? The answer requires careful investigation. Historians examine several factors. When was a text written? How close was it to the events it describes? What sources did the author use? Does it match what is known about the historical period? Does it contain ideas that appear to belong to the time of Jesus or to later generations? These questions help researchers separate earlier traditions from later developments. But even with careful analysis, some uncertainty remains. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the mystery alive. The search for the lost years also reveals something important about human memory. History is not simply a recording machine. Events are remembered through communities. Stories are passed from one generation to another. Details can become clearer, or they can become forgotten. Sometimes memories are preserved because people believe they are important. Other times they disappear because no one thought they would matter. The silence surrounding Jesus' early adulthood may not mean something was hidden. It may simply mean those years were not recorded by the people who preserved his story. But there is another reason the lost years continue to attract attention. The beginning of Jesus' public ministry appears almost sudden. One moment, history knows very little. Then suddenly, an adult Jesus appears, gathering followers and delivering teachings that challenge the assumptions of his time. This transformation creates a natural curiosity. What happened inside that person during those years? What experiences shaped his understanding of humanity? What moments influenced the ideas that would later spread throughout the world? This is where history reaches its limits, because history can investigate events. It can examine documents. It can analyze archaeology. But it cannot fully reveal a person's private thoughts. It cannot show every conversation, every moment of reflection, every personal experience. The inner development of a person is often the hardest thing for history to recover, and perhaps that is why the lost years of Jesus remain so compelling. They represent not only a missing period of time, they represent the hidden process of becoming. Every influential person has a hidden story before the world recognizes them. Before a scientist makes a discovery, before an artist creates a masterpiece, before a leader changes history, there are years of preparation that often remain unknown. The world sees the result, but rarely sees the journey. In the case of Jesus, those hidden years have become one of the most discussed mysteries in religious history. But among all the theories surrounding the lost years, one question continues to return. Was Jesus simply living an ordinary life in Nazareth? Or was something extraordinary happening beyond the historical record? This question has created some of the most controversial discussions surrounding Jesus. Because beyond the ancient texts and historical evidence, there are also stories that exist outside mainstream scholarship. Stories of secret journeys, hidden teachings, forgotten encounters. And these stories have captured the imagination of millions. One of the most famous examples involves claims that Jesus traveled to India. The theory became especially popular in the modern era through books and writers who argued that Jesus may have studied with Eastern teachers. Some supporters of this idea point to similarities between certain spiritual teachings: compassion, renunciation, inner transformation, the search for truth. They suggest that these similarities may indicate a deeper connection between different traditions. But historians remain cautious. Similar ideas can appear in different cultures without direct contact. Human beings across societies often ask similar questions. Why do we suffer? What is the meaning of life? How should people treat one another? The existence of similar teachings does not automatically prove a historical connection. Still, the popularity of these theories tells us something important. The mystery of Jesus' lost years is powerful because it exists at the border between what is known and what is imagined. People are naturally drawn toward unanswered questions. They want to discover the hidden chapter. They want to see behind the story. They want to know the person behind the symbol. And perhaps that curiosity is one of the reasons the mystery has survived for so long. But the deeper we go, the larger the question becomes. Maybe the greatest mystery is not where Jesus was during those years. Maybe the greatest mystery is why humanity continues searching for him. Why do people across cultures and generations continue to examine his life? Why do historians continue studying his words? Why do believers continue finding meaning in his story? And why does a question from 2,000 years ago still feel relevant today? Because the story of Jesus is not only about the past, it is also about the present. It is about how human beings search for meaning, how civilizations build identity, how beliefs shape societies, and how a single life can become a mirror through which humanity examines itself. The lost years remain lost, the evidence remains incomplete, the debates continue, but perhaps the unanswered questions are not a weakness of history. Perhaps they are what make history human, because behind every ancient mystery is the same desire that has always driven humanity, the desire to understand where we came from and to discover what shaped the people and ideas that changed our world. For centuries, the question of Jesus' lost years has remained unanswered, but perhaps the reason this mystery survives is not because historians have failed to find the answer. Perhaps it survives because the question itself reveals something deeper about humanity. We are not only fascinated by events, we are fascinated by transformation. We want to understand the moment when an ordinary person becomes extraordinary. We want to know what happens in the hidden years before history begins watching. And in the case of Jesus, those hidden years exist at the beginning of one of the greatest transformations the world has ever witnessed. When historians examine the evidence, one conclusion becomes clear. There is no confirmed historical record showing exactly what Jesus did between childhood and the beginning of his public ministry. The silence remains. But silence does not necessarily mean mystery. And mystery does not automatically mean a hidden secret. Sometimes history simply leaves behind unanswered questions. The challenge for historians is accepting that uncertainty, because the desire for a complete story is powerful. Human beings naturally want beginnings, middle sections, and endings. We want every missing piece to fit perfectly. But the past rarely works that way. The ancient world was filled with people whose lives shaped history, but whose personal stories remain incomplete. The majority of individuals who lived during the time of Jesus are completely unknown today. Their names disappeared, their voices disappeared, their experiences disappeared. History remembers only fragments, a few documents, a few archaeological discoveries, a few references preserved through generations. And from those fragments, historians attempt to rebuild a world that vanished thousands of years ago. Perhaps this is what makes the lost years of Jesus so fascinating. They remind us that even the most famous people in history were once unknown. Before the teachings, before the followers, before the influence. There was simply a person living in a particular place, during a particular moment in history. Someone experiencing the same uncertainty, questions, and challenges that every human being experiences. For believers, the hidden years may represent preparation, a period where Jesus grew, learned, and developed before beginning his mission. For historians, they represent an unanswered question requiring careful examination. For skeptics, they represent an example of how legends and traditions develop around influential figures. Each perspective approaches the mystery differently, and perhaps understanding all of these perspectives is more valuable than choosing only one. Because history is not only about discovering facts. It is also about understanding how people create meaning from those facts. The relationship between history and belief has always been complicated. History asks, what can we demonstrate through evidence? Faith asks, what meaning does this story hold? These questions are not always identical. A historian may analyze ancient manuscripts and archaeological findings. A believer may look at the same story and see spiritual significance. Neither approach can completely replace the other because they are answering different questions. And the story of Jesus has endured partly because it exists in both worlds. The world of historical investigation and the world of human belief. This is why debates about the lost years continue, not simply because people want to know where Jesus traveled, but because they want to understand the person behind the story. They want to know what shaped his ideas, what influenced his message, what experiences prepared him for the moment when he stepped into history. These questions are not unique to Jesus. They are questions we ask about every person who changes the world. Consider the hidden years of any great figure. Before the invention that changes science, before the speech that changes politics, before the artwork that changes culture, there is always a period that remains unseen. A period of learning, a period of struggle, a period of becoming. The world remembers the moment of transformation, but rarely sees the process that created it. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Jesus' lost years is not what happened during those years. Perhaps it is what those years represent. They represent the unknown parts of every human life, the experiences that shape us before anyone notices, the conversations that change our thinking, the moments of reflection that alter our direction, the silent years that prepare us for the moments when our choices matter. And this may be why people continue searching. Because the mystery of Jesus' hidden years is also a reflection of our own questions. Where do our beliefs come from? What experiences shape who we become? How much of our identity is created by the world around us, and how much is created by moments that no one else ever sees? After 2,000 years, the evidence remains incomplete. No discovery has revealed a hidden diary from Jesus. No ancient document has provided a complete timeline. No archaeological finding has ended the debate. The mystery remains. But perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps it is what makes the story continue. Because unanswered questions invite investigation. They encourage curiosity. They remind us that history is not a finished book. It is a conversation between the past and the present. The lost years of Jesus may never be fully reconstructed. The truth may remain partly hidden behind the distance of time. But the search itself reveals something important. Human beings are driven by the desire to understand. We search ancient ruins, we study forgotten writings, we analyze fragments of the past not only because we want information, but because we want connection. We want to understand the people who came before us, and through them understand ourselves. Perhaps the final question is not, where was Jesus during the lost years? Perhaps the deeper question is, why does humanity continue searching for answers about a person who lived 2,000 years ago? Maybe the answer is found not only in history, maybe it is found in something deeper. A human desire to discover meaning, a desire to understand purpose, a desire to believe that our lives are connected to something larger than ourselves. The story of the lost years of Jesus remains unfinished, and perhaps it always will, but every generation continues asking new questions. Every generation examines the evidence again. Every generation searches for meaning in the space between what is known and what remains unknown. And maybe that is the true mystery. Not simply what happened in those missing years, but why those missing years continue to matter. Thank you for joining The Last Belief as we explored one of history's most fascinating unanswered questions. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient history, forgotten mysteries, and the questions that continue to shape humanity, consider subscribing to The Last Belief. Every week we explore the hidden stories behind religions, civilizations, historical mysteries, and the beliefs that have influenced the world we live in today. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries are not found in the answers we already have. They are found in the questions we are still brave enough to ask.